January meetings are supposed to smell like optimism, coffee, resolutions, hollow smiles, instead. Caleb Rothman turned the first gathering of the year into a cleanup operation. He stood at the head of the table, sleeves rolled just enough to look approachable, talking about culture reset and future-facing efficiency while his eyes slid past people like numbers on a spreadsheet. Then he stopped on me. "Kayla, clean out your desk. No preface, no context, no thank you." Just a sentence dropped in front of 20 people who suddenly found their notebooks fascinating. I had spent 18 years as Senior Operations Integrity Director, the person they called when shortcuts got dangerous and decisions needed a conscience. That role never showed up on quarterly slides, which made it easy to erase. Caleb didn't even look uncomfortable. He was young, polished, confident in that way men get when they mistake momentum for wisdom. "We're streamlining," he said smoothly, "removing friction, building a faster company." Apparently, I was friction, a cost center, an outdated safeguard from a slower era. The humiliation wasn't loud, it was surgical. He didn't criticize my work because that would require knowing it. He didn't explain the decision because explanations invite questions. He simply moved on, already discussing next steps. As if my career had been a minor agenda item he'd efficiently closed. I felt the shock settle first, then the heat of being dismissed in public. "So this is the reset," I said evenly. "Cut the one person paid to say no?" No one answered. Silence is very loyal to power. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I didn't cry. "Understood," I added. Because dignity sometimes sounds like compliance. When the room went quiet again, I stood. I smiled, not because I felt calm, but because silence was the only response he hadn't planned for. From my bag, I took out a small envelope and placed it gently on the table in front of him. Caleb smirked, amused, maybe expecting drama. I leaned in just enough for him to hear me. "Don't open it now," I said quietly. "Open it when you're alone." For the first time that morning, his confidence flickered. The room stayed frozen, every eye avoiding mine, while the injustice hung there sharp, immediate, and unfinished. Have you ever walked into a new year expecting a fresh start, only to be blindsided by something you never saw coming? How did it make you feel? Angry? Numb? Or strangely calm like I was in that room? Tell me where you're listening from right now. Because stories like this tend to find people who've lived them. If this moment feels familiar, subscribe and stay with me. The real consequences are just beginning. I packed my office the way you pack after a loss, slowly, carefully, as if sudden movement might make it worse. I didn't announce it. I didn't ask for boxes. I just started lifting pieces of my working life into my arms and setting them down somewhere new, somewhere temporary. The hallway stayed quiet, not out of respect, but avoidance. People looked up, then looked away. Screens became fascinating. Coffee cups suddenly needed refills. I had been the person they came to when something felt wrong, when a shortcut threatened to become a scandal. Now I was something contagious. Watching me leave meant imagining themselves next. As I cleared a drawer, memory pressed in. I remembered being the one who stayed late to slow things down, who asked the questions nobody wanted asked. Are we allowed to do this? What happens if it fails? Who carries the risk when it does? I wasn't popular for it, but the company stayed upright. Someone had to say no before no one could. Caleb Rothman never did that work. He came from finance, from clean spreadsheets and clean exits. He talked about strategy in terms of numbers, not people. He had never stayed through a collapse, never sat with a team while everything burned, and the only option was accountability. He arrived after the mess, praised the recovery, and called it leadership. I slid a framed photo into my bag and remembered the deals I had stopped from crossing lines that couldn't be uncrossed. The vendor contract I froze when the math didn't match the ethics. The restructuring I delayed because it would have gutted compliance. Each time, someone complained. Each time, the company survived. Stability became the story Caleb sold upstairs. And somehow, it became his achievement. There were reports with my handwriting in the margins, warnings softened into questions so executives could save face. I absorbed anger meant for others, signed off on delays, and carried blame quietly. That kind of work never shows up on a resume, but it keeps companies alive long enough for leaders like him to look brilliant. That was the injustice. He inherited calm and branded it progress. He took credit for balance he never created, for risks he never absorbed. I had absorbed them quietly, consistently, because that was the job, because integrity doesn't announce itself. I carried my box past conference rooms where I had once argued for restraint, past people who nodded without meeting my eyes. No one said goodbye. No one said thank you. Silence followed me like a policy. At the elevator, a voice broke it, soft, rushed, almost afraid to exist. "Kayla," someone whispered. I turned. "You know he broke his own promise today, right?" The doors waited. My chest tightened, but my face stayed calm. So did I. For now, I didn't think about the promise while I walked to my car. Shock had burned it out of me. What replaced it was clarity, sharp and unwelcome. Somewhere between the parking lot and the driver's seat, memory stepped forward, calm and precise, like it had been waiting for permission. Years earlier, long before titles hardened into weapons, Ethan was still the COO. He wasn't cruel then, just ambitious and eager to be seen as steady. We sat in a small conference room with legal present, talking about transition plans and ethical continuity. The company was growing fast, and growth always brings temptation. Someone had to stay long enough to keep lines from blurring. Ethan nodded through the discussion. "We need stability through the end of the year," he said, "especially through New Year. No sudden exits." He framed it as leadership responsibility, as protection against chaos. Legal drafted the memo while we talked. It wasn't dramatic, it was procedural, deliberate, and boring in the way important things often are. The commitment was simple. I would remain through the new year to oversee integrity handoff and unresolved compliance matters. In return, leadership acknowledged that role as essential, not optional. Ethan signed without hesitation. There was a timestamp, clean and official, legal initialed. The board secretary logged it. Everyone moved on. I didn't keep a copy because I was suspicious. I didn't keep it because I trusted him. I believed that a man who spoke that carefully about responsibility would remember what he put his name on. I believed the promise didn't need guarding. Promises, I thought, protected themselves. Driving home, the pieces aligned. Ethan today wasn't the man from that room. He spoke faster now, louder, surrounded by applause instead of questions. But documents don't age the way people do. They don't forget what they were created to do. The realization settled quietly. This wasn't personal retaliation. It wasn't emotional leverage. It was structure doing exactly what it was designed to do when memory failed. Ethan could forget the meeting, the context, even the intent. The system could not. I pulled into my driveway and sat there longer than necessary. The anger stayed contained, compressed into something usable. I wasn't panicking. I wasn't celebrating. I was thinking. Ethan didn't remember the promise. That much was clear. But legal remembered. The board secretary remembered. The timestamp remembered. And for the first time since the meeting, I understood something with complete certainty. I hadn't been erased. I had been activated. The calm came from that knowledge alone. When systems are built correctly, they respond without anger or mercy. They simply respond. And that was enough to steady my hands, slow my breath, and let logic take the lead. I was ready to wait. Most listeners miss what just happened here. Did you hear it? I didn't file a lawsuit. That was the first decision. And it was deliberate. Lawsuits make noise too early, and noise gives people time to hide. I wanted movement without alarms, consequences without spectacle. So instead of attacking, I stepped aside cleanly, formally, and in writing. The notice I sent was brief, effective immediately. I am withdrawing from all ethics and integrity oversight responsibilities. No accusations, no explanations, just a factual statement of absence. I copied legal and the board secretary, exactly as protocol required. When I pressed send, I felt something settle into place. Control doesn't always come from force. Sometimes it comes from letting go. Within days, the systems I had quietly buffered began behaving like systems without buffers. Emails that once stopped at my desk kept moving. Questions that used to be softened were forwarded raw. Decisions went through without the extra layer that asked, "Are we sure I had been the pause?" Without me, nothing paused anymore. I watched from a distance as the volume increased. Messages multiplied, threads grew longer. Someone replied, all when they shouldn't have. A vendor asked for clarification no one could give. "Why is this escalating?" Caleb asked in one meeting, irritation leaking through his composure. He didn't know the answer because the answer had never been visible. Risk surfaced faster than he expected. A policy exception slid through unchecked. A timeline compressed until it cracked. The company didn't collapse, it just got louder. Louder questions, louder objections, louder consequences. Stability, it turned out, had required effort. Caleb pushed back. "Of course. We're still compliant," he said. "We don't need extra layers slowing us down." No one contradicted him. They rarely do when speed is rewarded. But the emails kept coming. Decisions lacked signatures they used to have. Approvals arrived without context. I could feel the architecture I'd built showing its outline. I stayed quiet. That was part of the calculation. Silence lets patterns reveal themselves. Each small issue stacked neatly on the next. Not catastrophic, just uncomfortable. Enough to expose the absence without pointing to me. Then the ping landed. It was brief, neutral, unmistakable, legal. Copying only Caleb. "Who's handling integrity review?" Now I read it once and closed my laptop. There was no satisfaction yet, just confirmation. The system had reached for the role it expected to exist and found nothing there. That question wasn't an accusation. It was a mirror. Caleb would answer it soon, and when he did, he would finally see what he had removed and what removing it had already started to cost. The first crack didn't sound dramatic. It arrived quietly, disguised as a routine question from outside the building, and that made it more dangerous. An early-year decision Ethan approved, a fast-tracked partnership meant to signal momentum, was suddenly being challenged by an external watchdog group. Not accused, not condemned, just questioned. That was enough. I felt the tension before anyone said my name. Reporters called the communications office, asking why certain safeguards had been bypassed. Analysts asked how the risk had been assessed. Ethan's language, usually confident and polished, started to wobble. He spoke in numbers and speed. But no one was translating the ethical context anymore. Without that translation, his answers landed flat. I watched the reactions ripple outward. Emails grew careful. Meetings ran longer. People hesitated before committing. Ethan noticed the shift and didn't like it. "This is overblown," he said in a leadership call. "We're compliant. We're within policy." Compliance, without interpretation, sounded thin. He pushed back hard. "We can't let outdated thinking slow us down," he added, his voice sharpening. Then, inevitably, my name surfaced. "Kayla overstayed her relevance," he said later. "According to someone who was there, we need progress, not gatekeepers." It was easier to dismiss a person than to confront the vacuum they left behind. The media didn't care about that explanation. They asked who reviewed the decision. They asked what checks had been applied. They asked whether leadership had considered downstream impact. Each question required judgment, not metrics. Each answer needed a moral spine. Ethan had removed that spine, and was now trying to stand straight without it. I didn't celebrate. Satisfaction stayed contained, folded into patience. This wasn't collapse, it was exposure. The decision itself wasn't catastrophic, just poorly framed and insufficiently filtered. Exactly the kind of situation I used to intercept before it reached daylight. Ethan grew defensive. He blamed advisors. He blamed timing. He blamed resistance to change. We're being punished for moving fast. He told the board. No one argued. But no one fully agreed either. Silence again. But this time, it leaned away from him. Then came the meeting that mattered. The board reviewed the situation, not angrily, but methodically. Questions were asked, timelines examined. And finally, the chair leaned forward and spoke the one sentence that shifted the room. Why wasn't this filtered? The question hung there. Precise and surgical. I wasn't in the room, but I felt it land. That wasn't about the decision. It was about absence. And once absence is noticed, it can't be unseen. This is where careful listeners lean in. Are you still with me? He opened the card later that night. Alone. Exactly the way I told him to. I know this because the timing fit too cleanly, and because silence has a pattern when it finally reaches someone like Ethan. Offices empty out, confidence fades, and truth gets loud in quiet rooms. I wasn't there to watch, but I could picture it easily. The envelope was plain. Nothing dramatic, nothing legal-looking, no threats, no demands, just paper and weight. He would have expected conditions, maybe a warning, maybe a reminder of consequences. What he found instead forced him inward. Inside was one sentence. His sentence. A leader must never begin a new year by breaking a promise. No bolding, no commentary. Just the line he had delivered years ago to a room full of executives who nodded because it sounded right. Below it sat the date. Clean and precise. Anchoring the words to a moment he could no longer escape. Beneath that, his signature, unmistakable in its confident slant. And finally, one smaller line, written without anger or flourish. You said this. I believed you. That was all. There was no accusation in it, no leverage, no request for repair. The power came from recognition, from forcing him to see himself without the noise he usually wrapped around decisions. I imagine his first reaction was irritation, then dismissal. But irritation can't survive evidence. Dismissal doesn't work when the voice staring back at you is your own. Ethan built his authority on momentum, on the idea that movement justified everything that followed. This card stopped that movement cold. It wasn't about me anymore. It was about who he claimed to be versus who he had become when speed replaced memory. He would have replayed the speech, remembered the applause, the sense of being principled without sacrifice. Back then, promises were abstract. Now one sat in his hands, dated, signed, and quietly intact. I picture him reading it twice, then again, slower. The room would have felt smaller, the words heavier. Leaders don't cry when they're angry. They cry when they recognize themselves in a moment they can't rewrite. That's when he sat down, not dramatically, not defeated, just unable to remain standing while the version of himself he once trusted looked back without blinking. No assistants, no lawyers, no spin, just a chair, a desk, and a truth that didn't need witnesses. I didn't need to hear what he said next. Silence told me everything. The card had done what arguments never could. It returned ownership. And once ownership is restored, consequences no longer feel external, they feel deserved. I knew the denial would come next. It always does when someone realizes the ground has shifted beneath them. Momentum turns into defensiveness, confidence into noise. Ethan didn't reach out to me. He reached for protection. First, he called legal. Not to ask what was right, but what was survivable. He wanted to know if the card meant exposure, if the promise could be framed as informal, if intent mattered more than ink. The answer, I later learned, was quiet and uncomfortable. The record existed. The language was clear. The timestamp was clean. Then he called public relations. That call was louder. He talked about optics, about narrative, about controlling the message before the message controlled him. "This is being blown out of proportion," he said. "It's a misunderstanding." PR asked what they were defending against. He didn't have a clean answer. The problem wasn't emotion, it was documentation. Promises age better than people do. The internal memo hadn't faded. Legal confirmed the signature. The board secretary confirmed the meeting. 2 witnesses confirmed the intent. Each confirmation tightened the space around him. He tried another angle. "She's retaliating," he told someone. That word traveled briefly before stopping cold. Retaliation requires action. I hadn't taken any. I had stepped back, formally, transparently, and within policy. Silence is hard to prosecute. Someone raised whistleblower protections, and that door closed fast. I hadn't reported him. I hadn't accused him. I had simply withdrawn from a role after being terminated in violation of a documented commitment. The law didn't need drama to work. It just needed sequence. Ethan's tone shifted. Frustration edged into panic. Calls overlapped. Meetings were scheduled, canceled, rescheduled. He kept insisting this was manageable, that leaders make hard calls all the time. But leadership doesn't erase records. It lives inside them. What fractured his confidence wasn't confrontation. It was agreement. Too many people nodded quietly when the facts were laid out. No one rushed to reassure him. No one dismissed the issue as trivial. Silence. Again. Chose a side. I stayed removed. Distance was part of the structure now. I watched the pieces move without touching them, watched denial exhaust itself against permanence. The louder he pushed, the more brittle he sounded. The message arrived without warning, a short notice from the board administrator, neutral in tone, precise in timing. An emergency meeting had been called. No agenda was shared, no preparation time was offered. And for the first time since this began, Ethan wasn't in control of the room he was about to enter. They didn't invite me to the boardroom to sue anyone. That surprised Ethan. It surprised me, too. The email was brief, respectful, and clear the board wanted an explanation, not a spectacle. I arrived with a single folder and no lawyer. Because this wasn't a fight, it was an accounting. I spoke only when asked. Short answers, precise language, no emotion to grab onto. I explained the promise, the meeting, the signature, the timestamp, the witnesses. I explained why I didn't keep a copy out of suspicion, but out of trust. I believed leadership meant memory, I said. Nothing more. Ethan sat across from me, hearing himself described in neutral terms that felt harsher than accusation. A leader who broke a promise. A leader who removed ethical review to move faster. A leader who inherited stability and called it innovation. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't editorialize. I just traced the sequence, step by step, the way systems do when they're asked to tell the truth. The room stayed quiet. Board members asked clarifying questions, not to trap me, but to confirm alignment. Each answer closed a loop. Each document matched a recollection. Each witness affirmed intent. Ethan tried to interject once. "That's not how I remember it," he said. The chair nodded and replied, "Memory isn't the standard here." I could see it then, the mirror effect. Ethan wasn't being attacked. He was being reflected. The words he once used about responsibility were now applied to him without adornment. Speed versus stewardship. Momentum versus duty. The contrast didn't need commentary. I explained my withdrawal from the ethics role. I didn't sabotage anything. I said, I stopped absorbing risk that wasn't mine to carry. That landed. Several heads nodded. Someone asked who had filled the role since my departure. No one answered. In that pause, I felt the exposure turn collective. It wasn't about blame anymore. It was about recognizing a missing function, a gap that had been disguised by confidence and pace. The board members exchanged looks that said the same thing without words. They had mistaken quiet protection for bureaucracy. And they had been wrong. That silence told them what they needed to know. The balance they'd relied on wasn't a policy, it was a person. Remove the person. And the noise begins. Not failure exposure. Ethan looked smaller by then, not diminished, but unarmored. He realized the room wasn't choosing sides, it was choosing structure, accountability over narrative, process over posture. The chair closed the discussion calmly. "We need to stabilize decision flow," she said. "Effective immediately. Ethan will temporarily step back from final approvals while we restore integrity review. No gavel, no drama, just a sentence that changed the shape of power." I gathered my folder and stood. The mirror had done its work. And the truth, once reflected, didn't blink. I walked out steady, knowing exposure had finished its job, and the system had chosen correction. The collapse didn't arrive as an explosion. It unfolded like gravity finally noticed. Headlines framed it as a New Year ethics scandal. But what they were really documenting was absence. Questions multiplied, timelines resurfaced, and decisions once praised as bold were suddenly examined under light that refused to flatter. Ethan lost credibility first. Interviews stopped, invitations dried up. The tone shifted from admiration to distance, the corporate version of a step backward. Power followed reputation out the door. Authority without trust is just a title, and titles don't survive scrutiny. No one defended him. That part was quieter than I expected. People didn't attack, they simply didn't step in. Silence again, choosing its side. The board restored interim safeguards, committees, reviews. Everything Ethan had dismissed as friction returned. Methodical and slow. The company didn't panic, it corrected. I was asked if I would come back, not officially, not with fanfare. Just a question passed through channels I still respected. I answered once. Clearly. No. Not out of bitterness, out of clarity. Returning would turn resolution into reversal, and I was finished negotiating with the past. Instead, I accepted a different offer. Higher up, broader scope. A role built around ethics rather than tolerance for it. It came without promises, because the structure itself was the promise. I left with my name intact and my spine straight, which felt like justice enough. The media cycle moved on. As it always does, what stayed behind were changes that didn't trend. Revised approval flows, documented handoffs, language that slowed decisions just enough to force responsibility back into the room. Justice isn't dramatic, it's procedural. What surprised me most was how quickly the narrative changed inside the company. Hallway conversations softened. People spoke carefully again. Decisions paused. Questions reappeared where silence had been rewarded. It wasn't fear driving that shift, it was relief. Someone had finally named what everyone felt, but avoided saying. The system didn't need a villain, it needed correction. I watched from the outside as governance did its quiet work. Not glamorous, not fast, but precise. Training sessions were rescheduled, review protocols reinstated. Small choices gained weight again. That kind of collapse looks boring from the outside. But from within, it feels like oxygen returning to a room that didn't know it was suffocating. No announcements followed, yet accountability settled in. Steady, unavoidable, and finally respected across departments, without noise or celebration. Then Ethan emailed me. Short subject line, careful tone. He asked for a private meeting, said he wanted to explain, to understand, to clear the air. I read it once and closed it. Some conversations arrive after their purpose has expired. I didn't reply, not because I couldn't forgive, but because I no longer needed to be involved. Silence, one last time, was the correct response. I stepped into my new role, knowing collapse isn't about watching someone fall. It's about watching a system choose integrity over convenience. and realizing you no longer have to hold it together alone. I began the year quietly, without announcements or resolutions. The noise had passed, and what remained felt steady, earned. I woke earlier than usual, not from anxiety, but from clarity, the kind that settles when nothing is chasing you anymore. There was no victory lap, no satisfaction in watching someone fall. Justice rarely feels loud from the inside. It feels like breathing, returning to a room that had learned to survive on shallow air. I stepped into my new role with calm hands, aware that responsibility carries weight only when it's chosen, not forced. Ethan's exit didn't make headlines. There was no scandalous press release or dramatic resignation letter. His name simply stopped appearing on emails, then on agendas, then on the website. Leadership changes were announced with neutral language, and the company kept moving. Careers don't always end with fire. Some end with erosion. I didn't speak about him. I didn't need to. Silence had already done its work. People adjusted. Processes slowed just enough. Questions were welcomed again. The systems I once protected were no longer dependent on one person. That was the point all along. One afternoon, a colleague forwarded me a link. Someone had resurfaced an old internal video, part of a leadership archive no one watched anymore. Ethan stood at a podium, younger, measured, saying a line that once sounded aspirational and now sounded exact. A leader must never begin a new year by breaking a promise. It traveled quietly, shared without commentary. No one needed to explain it. Context had arrived on its own. I closed the message and went back to work. My year had finally begun, not with revenge or validation, but with alignment. Justice didn't require my anger, only my memory. And memory, when it's honest, is enough to keep the future from repeating the past. Justice doesn't scream, it remembers. I carried no bitterness forward, only certainty, knowing that quiet endings last longer than loud ones, and that dignity, once reclaimed, reshapes time itself, guiding choices, shaping leadership, and leaving fewer scars behind for everyone who watches and learns silently. I didn't learn this lesson from winning. I learned it from standing still while everything tried to move past me. What stayed was the truth. Dignity doesn't need volume, and justice doesn't need permission. When you honor your values quietly, they outlast people who chase speed without memory. I felt the weight of loss. Yes, but I also felt the relief of no longer carrying what wasn't mine to hold. That's when calm becomes strength. If you could change one detail in this story, what would it be, and why would you have spoken sooner, walked away earlier, or trusted the system the way I did? And where are you listening from right now? If this moment felt familiar, share your thoughts in the comments. A like helps others find stories like this, and sharing keeps the conversation alive. Subscribe if you want to stay for what comes next, because sometimes the quietest choices shape the strongest futures.